Well, it is time now to talk about our feathered friends. Neil Hermes is our resident bird guru slash ornithologist, if you're being fancy. Neil, welcome.
Good morning, Tatjana. How are
Hello,
you?
I'm good, thank you. Are you out and about today bird watching?
I'm out with a group at Jerrabomber Wetlands, and we're actually currently looking at a black-faced cuckoo shrike in a tree and learning how to identify it.
Oh, okay. I haven't heard of that particular one.
Yeah, it's a one. They used to be called caterpillar eaters, and they're quite a common bird around Canberra. And this one's actually eating a caterpillar while we watch it, which is a good thing.
It's like you prepared it earlier, Neil. That's great.
Yeah, one I prepared earlier. They're sort of a nice ashy grey coloured bird with this brilliant black face. A very soft sort of bird, a very gentle sort of bird. And quite common, and a lovely bird. They make this exquisite little cup nest. But anyway, we're watching this one feeding on caterpillars at the moment.
There you go. Now, a couple of birding stories as usual, but if people have a question for you, 6255 1206, or they can email me on studio@2cc.net.au. Now, the first story is interesting, the impact of feeding birds in your backyard, because apparently a man in New York was prosecuted for feeding birds. What happened there?
Yeah, look, I'm not sure of the exact details of that one, but it does happen, and it in fact happens in Australia as well. Mm-hmm. So depending on, there are local ordinances with local councils in different places about feeding birds. It can either be to protect the birds in terms of, disease protection. It could also be because the birds are causing grief to neighbours. So white cockatoos, if they're fed in your garden, can cause problems for neighbours nearby. And I've seen situations where people have fed large numbers of white cockatoos in the garden, and the birds, while they've been waiting to feed, have done damage to other people's property nearby, like, destroying telephone aerials and all that sort of TV aerials, that sort of thing. So there are ordinances that are then brought in by councils to prohibit people from feeding, and if they continue, they can get prosecuted. So, look, it's about managing birds, and it's also managing the sort of interaction between birds and people in the suburbs.
I imagine it's kind of hard, though, because if you've got a bird feeder, unless you've got a bird security guard to keep out certain species, how do you differentiate, like, what the birds that you want in your garden as opposed to the ones you don't if you're feeding them?
Well, I had this question asked of me on my website. Someone was feeding birds and they wanted to keep the white cockatoos away because they can be quite destructive and they can make a huge mess. The thing to do is to actually create a device around the feeder so that only the smaller birds can get in. So the eastern rosellas or the grass parrots or the finches or whatever can get in. That you make a mesh that's small enough that they keeps the white cockies out. So people do actually like to try and keep cockies away sometimes, and there are methods of doing it. So, there can be compromises.
So I guess is the key really to focus more on having water in your backyard, do you think?
Look, water is always essential, and almost any Australian landscape, even where it's wet, in the summer months or in the dry months, having some water around is critical for birds. And I always have a bird bath wherever I live. Whenever I've lived anywhere in the country, I've had bird baths in my garden, properly located so cats can't get near the birds when they're on it. But water is the essential thing, then planting your garden appropriately. The feeding is an issue that does cause the actual feeding of seed or whatever is something that causes some grief. Some people say you shouldn't do it at all. The local bird club's policy is that you shouldn't do it at all. But we know that people do feed birds, and if they do, then it's a question of small amounts, healthy feeding, only good food, keeping the site clean. And if there's too many birds coming in causing problems with your neighbours, well, maybe you have to manage that as well.
I mean, and what do you suggest people feed birds? Because I guess there's a lot of schools of thought on what to do.
Yeah, well, the things that really work in Canberra that appropriately attract birds are wild bird seed, which you can get from local wholesalers, which has a good mix of different sorts of seed. Not too much sunflower, a lot of the smaller seeds. I think birds like the red-browed finches will come in and feed on that. That's the sort of thing, and some of the smaller parrots. They're the sorts of things that if you're feeding birds in your garden are probably the things to concentrate on, and certainly never things like bread or any artificial foods.
No, so I guess no feeding ducks old bread.
Absolutely no feeding ducks or swans old bread. No, that's bad completely bad for the bird, and really you're not doing them any giving them any advantages. swans and ducks largely eat vegetation that they find in the water, and that's hard to replicate.
It is. It's funny though. I've been guilty of doing that, of feeding bread to ducks, until I saw signs that said it wasn't good for them. So I wonder why something would become so popular if it's not good for the ducks. It seems really odd.
I think it's this sort of sense that and the birds will come up to you.
Yeah, of course they do. Yeah, and if you've got toddlers with you,
and you feel sort of obliged to sort of look after this bird that's clearly wanting to be fed.
Yeah.
And they've been fed bread before probably, and really it's killing the bird slowly. And the other thing is we want to interact with wildlife, and I think that's a good thing that people interact with wildlife. I think, seeing the wildlife, and especially when you've got children, pointing them out is great. But then feeding a duck or a swan bread doesn't actually help the bird at all.
Fair enough. Good advice there. Now, tell me about the Latham Snipe.
Well, it's interesting you should talk to me about Latham Snipe, because I'm standing right in the middle of Jerrabumba wetlands, which is where the Latham Snipe research is all being done. And there was a report just recently about the work that they're doing right here. They're trying to work out where the local birds move about. The ones here that are at the east end of the lake, do they move from here, say, to Lake George? Do they move around the wetlands around the city? Do they go out to Yerrabee? Do they go out to Lake Tuggeranong? Or do they spend all of their time here at the wetlands adjacent to Fishwick and Narrabundah? We'd like to know, because this bird is extremely rare, and as we know, it migrates to Hokkaido every year. So we know where it migrates to, but we don't know a lot about the rest of the bird living here in the wetlands. And there's a group that have put some trackers on them this season to try and work out locally how they're moving about in the ACT.
Now, we always love hearing endangered birds being spotted. So the captive bred endangered Regent Honeyeater was spotted in the Hunter Valley backyard.
Yeah, the lucky lady. She saw one in her backyard. She photographed it. The Regent Honeyeater is a bird that used to occur in tens of thousands along the east coast of Australia, reduced down to a handful of birds. There's a few spots around the Kapiti Valley. We get them in the ACT occasionally. So they have been releasing birds in various parts of New South Wales with colour bands on, and this lucky lady at Maitland got to see one, and she's been able to add to our story about where Regent Honeyeaters move to when they leave their breeding areas.
Fantastic. Now, how long are you out there at Jerrabumba today?
We're on one of my regular walks, Tatjana, so we'll be out here till about 11 o'clock, and hopefully we've already seen some interesting birds. Hopefully we'll see some more. And, of course, if people want to come on one of my bird walks in the future, just check out my website. There's details of my morning walks about once a month, a couple of times a month I do these walks.
I love that they're all coming out for you and, not making you look crazy when you say that they're around. Maybe you plant them there, Neil. Do you just have a bunch of birds that you hire and you just pop them in trees? Have I uncovered your secret? Or
Tatjana, you're not just covering possibly challenging me, but challenging my ethics here as well. No, would I ever do that? No, look, we're watching wild birds, which is lovely, and that's the thing about a bird watching walk, is you never know what you're going to see.
Yeah,
and you can be lucky and see some interesting things, or maybe have a quiet day. You never know.
Are you ever stumped by a bird, like when you see one and you've got a group of people and you're under pressure?
Of course. I mean, you can't know everything about everything, and depending on where you are. I mean, around Canberra, that's hard to do for me now. But, if I'm away, I get stumped by birds. Of course you do. And even the very best bird watchers in certain places, they'll be challenged, especially if they're travelling.
Well, I'm still wanting to stump you with the best bird pun ever, but I'm yet to succeed, Neil.
Yeah, well, let's keep working on it, Tatjana. I think we've got a long history ahead of us to explore that particular thing.
That's right. I will get you one day. Neil, as always, you've got plenty of bird watching coming up, so I guess we encourage people to head to your website.
Yes, neilhermes.com.au. Lovely. Thanks, Tatjana.
Wonderful. Thanks, Neil. Have a great day out. See you.